Herbert Fingerette, describing Confucius' orientation in this regard, suggests, well, let's look at one of our most common rituals, shaking hands. Suppose you go to a job interview and you shake hands with a person. What does that do? Well, first of all, it creates a kind of rapport. It suggests a respect for the other person. Now, sometimes there are real disasters in handshakes. Occasionally, you have the impression that someone really doesn't know how to shake hands very effectively, or you get the impression they really kind of don't really like to get that close to people. This indicates something too. Basically, we use the handshake as a means of conveying who we are in relation to another person. Once again, we see this emphasis on relationship. What rituals do is provide a kind of basic vocabulary, if you will, for interacting with other people. And if you're part of a society and you've learned this basic vocabulary, you don't have to think about it all the time. It's something that just comes naturally. I think for most of us, coming into a situation like a job interview where someone extends their hand, it's not going to be any question to us what we're supposed to do. In fact, I think even reflecting on this wouldn't occur to most of us. It's just very obvious what a handshake is. And the idea is, as Confucius sees it, by doing something even that simple, you've elevated the level of interaction. You've indicated something like respect. You've done something to, in a way, beautify the situation. You've basically shown what it is that you're intending to do, namely relate to the person in a kind of straightforward, understanding, trusting way. The Analects, this work put together by disciples of Confucius, attributes to Confucius the following line: "He who does not know the rights cannot take his stand." What that means is that if you are in a society but you've kind of missed learning this vocabulary, you've really got a lot of problems. Imagine someone coming from a society where shaking hands wasn't the thing to do. People just didn't do it. Such a person would really have trouble knowing how to respond in that kind of situation. And we actually tend to feel a little bit unnerved if in a gesture of friendship like shaking hands, someone seems to be uncomfortable with it. Knowing the social vocabulary makes things run very smoothly. Not knowing it causes things to be interrupted. So in a disruptive time, like the time that Confucius was living in, all the more important to maintain these kind of gestures that allow people to communicate with each other in a more subtle way and a more immediate way in some respects than words would allow. It gives people a sense of real fellow feeling when they can engage in rituals together. Another thing that Confucius points out, besides the fact that it's hard to really take your place in society if you don't know the society's rituals, is that ritual has a wonderful quality of bringing people into harmony spontaneously. Another passage from the Analects. The master said, "Govern the people by regulations, keep order among them by chastisements, and they will flee from you and lose all self-respect. Govern them by moral force, keep order among them by ritual, and they will keep their self-respect and come to you of their own accord." What he's saying here is that, of course, it is possible to get people to do what you want them to do if you have enough force at your disposal. But you certainly can't get people to cooperate by that means. In fact, oftentimes, forcing people to do something is a means of ensuring that they're not going to cooperate. So his suggestion is it's, of course, possible to control society by extreme law and order measures. Again, he's implicitly attacking some of the warlords and their techniques. You can get people to do what you want to a degree as long as you threaten them enough. But what happens anytime you're not looking? Well, they're going to try to circumvent you. In fact, it might become a long-term strategy of theirs to circumvent you because you've built in this kind of tendency to feel complete distrust. On the contrary, if the way people are organized is by means of rituals, this kind of vocabulary of social politeness, social form, people work with these rituals themselves. People learn how to do things and tailor them to their own situation. people enjoy embracing a kind of harmonious attitude toward other people, because indeed there is something in us that is deeply satisfied by ritual. You might say that it confers a kind of dignity on all our everyday interactions that reminds us of something like human respect for each other and so on. Now, one of the things that becomes an issue in Chinese thought is whether this emphasis on ritual ends up being too external. The Taoists in particular, as we'll talk about later, complain that Confucius places a lot of emphasis on these external matters, observing the proper forms, knowing what the proper forms are. And they point out that not everybody who observes forms actually has a very sincere intention. Certainly, Confucius' idea was not that people should go through the forms regardless of what they're feeling. It seems more the suggestion that people direct their feelings, express their feelings in harmonious ways by means of having certain forms. At one point in the Analects, Confucius is talking about showing respect for parents. And one of the things that he claims, something that I think in translation seems rather startling, is that the important thing is the demeanor. Now, that might not seem very obvious, because I think when we think of demeanor, we think of the way people carry themselves and move. And you might say, well, it's more important to get your parents enough to eat when they're old than having the right demeanor. But what Confucius seems to be suggesting here is that it really should be something that comes from your whole being. It's certainly possible by means of demeanor to indicate when you're not tuned into a ritual. I could think of cases where people sort of feel like they need to be civil, but they aren't really feeling that way. I've been to meetings at times where people will say hello, but you know what they're really thinking is, I hope I can manage to circumvent what you're going to try to do at this meeting. The hello in that case almost comes off as a little bit insulting, because it's not really trying to convey a sense of well-being or concern for your well-being, but instead it's really just going through the motions. Demeanor, the way you move, can also indicate certain things about whether or not you're fully into what it is that you're saying or not. I think any of us would be really disturbed if we went to a wedding where we got the impression that people were just going through the motions. If the bride and groom sort of mechanically were repeating their vows and you didn't sense that there was any kind of emotion between them, I think everybody would end up leaving the wedding feeling really kind of sickened by it. And the problem there is that there's just this kind of external charade of going through the motions, not a kind of real sense of being part of a ritual. So the Confucian ideal is not to just regiment yourself into certain kinds of behaviors. I think a way of looking at this that might resonate kind of directly with Western experience might be the relationship between being a polite person and reading an etiquette book. Of course, if you're going to address a letter to the President, the Pope, the Queen of England, it's maybe useful to have an etiquette book that tells you what the appropriate form of address is, just in case these are not things that come to your mind frequently. But I think if someone sincerely tried to utilize all the rules in an etiquette book in their everyday behavior, as opposed to just responding, we think there is something a little bit stilted about that person. Not only stilted, but someone who's really kind of missed the point. To be polite is not really just a function of doing certain kinds of things. It's interacting in a way that is appreciative of other people. If someone sneezes and someone says Gesundheit, again, that's kind of a ritual, I think, in much of our society, or bless you. It's something that is really kind of trivial, you might think. But nevertheless, it's one of those ways in which we indicate concern for the other people, for the other person, concern for their health, even if it's almost reflex. And it's important that some of these sort of things can become habits without their losing their vitality. It is possible, of course, to say Gesundheit almost automatically, but there's still a kind of background level of concern, presumably, behind it, or at least one would hope so. And in all the kinds of rituals that we engage in, the idea of being really tuned in to interacting with other people and sincere about it is really pretty fundamental.